So I joined when I was 17, still in high school, joined the National Guard. Didn't really have any plans on what I wanted to do. I figured the National Guard would be a great way to pay for some schooling, which I planned on after high school. And I was patriotic. You know, I always had this idea that I wanted to serve and wanted to add value and wanted to be a warrior and a contributor to society. The National Guard seemed like a good route because it was, you know, you had your weekend drills that you did and you had some activities that you had to do during the summer, but you could also be a civilian, right? Civilian soldier in a way. And then in 2003, we got activated and we went to Colorado. We were about a week out when they pulled that Saddam statue down in Baghdad. And I remember watching that in the chow hall a week before we were supposed to go. So they get us together and they say, hey, you know what? Never mind. We're not going. You're going to go to Fort Lewis in Washington State and you're going to train ROTC cadets. So we did that for the summer. And then in 2004. Yeah, it was 2004, Thanksgiving of 2004. My wife and I were newly married. I think we'd been married for about 5 months at the time. We were down in Southern California. I was managing a retail clothing store down there. And my section chief calls me up and he's like, hey, I got some news for you. We've been activated. This was a day before Thanksgiving. So I drive to Southern Utah, which is where her family was and where we're from. So I drive to Southern Utah. She was already there to have dinner. So I drive up there and I'm sitting there eating dinner and my father-in-law says, Ryan, what's wrong with you? Did your unit get activated or something? Just joking. He was joking around. I don't know why he would say that as a joke. What came to his mind to say that? And the only thing I could say at the moment was, actually, yeah, our unit has been activated. My wife didn't even know at the time. The family didn't know. And I left in January of 2005. We did 6 months training stateside and then a year in Iraq. When what you do literally represents the difference between life and death, you start to realize the weight of your consequences. Most people don't have consequences for their choices. I mean, you have a bad day at work, you get reprimanded, you know, even if you lose your job, welfare kicks in, pays it for you, like there's no consequence for your decisions. When you're in battle, there's heavy consequences. Somebody dies. And not just somebody, the guy that you're responsible for. And I remember I played softball with a friend of mine. He's actually been on the podcast. His name's Braxton McCoy. And of all things we played softball in the middle of a desert in Ramadi, Iraq. And we were playing softball one day. 2 days later, he gets a mission to go to a glass factory. And part of our unit's mission was recruiting. So responsible for recruiting civilian Iraqis to their security and police force. So he goes on this mission, and one of the Marines and the Marine dog handlers and the dog alerts to an individual, jumps on the individual. That individual blows himself up, and he's packed with a vest full of explosives and ball bearings, shatters his arms, shatters his legs, almost kills him. And it was so weird at the time to think, 2 days later, I was turning a double play. You know, I was playing shortstop, he's playing second base. I was turning a double play with him. And then that happens. And you start to realize this is legitimate. Like there's consequences for our actions. That's something that's stuck with me forever. And every little action, not just the life and death situations, but how many of us are indifferent to the way that we show up? You know, how many of us are indifferent to the way that we communicate with our wife because she'll always be there? Or the way that we communicate with our kids because we're the boss and they need to do what we tell them to do. And we don't think about how fragile life is. And we don't think about how powerful we are. I mean, we really are. If you think about the words, if you think about our actions, and yes, it's more magnified in a combat environment, but that taught me a lot about what leadership means. It taught me a lot about service. It taught me a lot about the words I choose to use, the actions, the behaviors, the thoughts that I have, and how powerful they are and why they matter. I think there's a lot of people who think that what they say and do doesn't matter. And that's not true. It matters to you and it matters to the people around you. So it was a big learning experience for me.
Made you more of a man?
100%. Because what it means to be a man, first of all, is somebody who takes accountability and responsibility for himself and those he has an obligation for. So when I was sitting in Iraq, and part of what I did while I was there, I was in charge of base defense. I was like a ship supervisor base defense. So we had observation posts all the way around the base. And what those observation posts were looking for is any sort of threat. And as they would recognize and see those threats, it was my job to take that information, go through the data and figure out what the heck was happening, and then figure out a way to respond to that. The way that I communicate and the way that I choose to respond to that situation spells the difference between life and death. I had to take responsibility for myself and for other people I didn't even know. I had to take responsibility for. And that translates perfectly into running a business, leading a family, coaching a sports team, being involved in your community, any other capacity in which we serve.